Imagine this. You're sitting in a dark theater, the screen glowing, the story unfolding. It begins with a happy couple. They live in a cozy home. They smile for photographs. They look like the very definition of stability. But then, something shatters. The wife goes missing. The husband steps forward to plead for her return. Cameras roll. The community rallies. But the more we watch him, the less we believe him. He looks too calm. He doesn't cry. His story doesn't add up. If this sounds like the opening of a thriller, you're right. But it's also the reality of some of the darkest true crime cases in modern history. Movies like Gone Girl and Prisoners grip us because they feel almost too real. They expose the cracks beneath the polished surface of family life. They play with our fears that the people closest to us might be hiding the darkest secrets. And the unsettling truth is this. They mirror real murders almost perfectly that we're drawn to these stories because they blur the line between entertainment and reality. They scare us because they could be us, our neighbors, our marriages, our families. Before we dive deep into the parallels between thrillers and true crime, I need your help. This series is about confronting the darkest truths and telling them in full, unfiltered detail. So if you want to stay with me on this journey, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon so you don't miss what's next. And if you want to go even deeper, if you want to help decide which cases and themes we cover in the future, consider becoming a channel member. Members can suggest topics, vote on future episodes, and get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content. Now let's begin episode 1. The perfect thriller? When crime movies mirror real murders. Thrillers that feel too real. Thrillers capture us because they begin in familiar places. A living room, a quiet street, a couple preparing for their future. We recognize these settings, and that recognition makes the twists hit harder. When something terrible happens in a thriller, it doesn't happen in a dark alley or some faraway land. It happens in the kind of home we all live in or dream of living in. And that's exactly why they mirror real crimes so well. Take Gone Girl, for example. In Gillian Flynn's best-selling novel and the 2014 film adaptation, Amy Dunn disappears. Her husband Nick becomes the prime suspect. At first, he insists on his innocence. But as the story unfolds, we learn about lies, affairs, and the power of perception. Nick's calmness, his flat tone, his inability to perform grief in the way the media expects, makes the world doubt him. And that doubt grows until it becomes certainty. Now think back to December 2002, Modesto, California. Lacey Peterson, 8 months pregnant, disappears from her home. Her husband, Scott Peterson, tells police he went fishing. He attends vigils. He stands beside his grieving in-laws. He faces cameras. But the more the world watches, the less they believe him. Why is he so calm? Why doesn't he cry? Why does he look more like an actor than a husband in pain? The parallels are undeniable. Even Gillian Flynn admitted that media-saturated cases like Scott Peterson's helped shape Gone Girl. She saw how narratives could form in the absence of proof, how demeanor could become evidence in itself, how perception could damn a man before a jury ever did. Fiction mirrored reality, and then reality was judged through the lens of fiction. It wasn't just Gone Girl. Denis Villeneuve's Prisoners, released in 2013, told another story that felt torn from the headlines. 2 young girls disappear. The community unites in fear. A father, played by Hugh Jackman, grows desperate, convinced a mentally challenged man knows the truth. He kidnaps him, tortures him, crosses every line he thought he never would. The movie asks us, what would you do if your child vanished? How far would you go? Would you stay within the law? Or would grief and fear push you beyond it? Now think of the parents of Elizabeth Smart, kidnapped in 2002, or the family of J.C. Dugard, taken in 1991 and not found until 2009. Their grief was real. Their desperation was real. They didn't torture suspects, but they lived through years of unimaginable pain, clinging to hope, begging for answers. Prisoners may have been fiction, but the emotions were not. And then there are cases where reality doesn't just echo fiction, it surpasses it. Scott Peterson's story played out like a Hollywood script. The handsome husband, the pregnant wife, the picture-perfect marriage hiding cracks beneath the surface. When Lacey vanished, the world rallied. Posters were printed. Search parties were organized. Vigils were held. Cameras rolled as Scott made statements. And while Sharon Rocha wept for her missing daughter, Scott stood beside her, stiff, calm, detached. The more we watched, the less we trusted him. The same thing happened with Chris Watts. In 2018, his wife Shanann and their 2 daughters vanished. Chris stood before cameras, his arms crossed, his words oddly flat. He begged for their safe return, but the world didn't believe him. Within days, investigators revealed the truth. He had murdered them all. Watching his interview today feels like watching a thriller scene. The villain is acting his part, but not well enough to convince the audience. Thrillers don't just entertain us, they train us. They teach us how villains look, how liars sound, how husbands turned killers should behave. And when real men like Scott Peterson or Chris Watts fail to meet the script of the grieving husband, suspicion ignites. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not. But either way, fiction shapes the way we interpret reality. Look at Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. Their story could have been written as a supernatural thriller. Secret marriages, doomsday prophecies, missing children, coded talk about light and dark spirits. If a novelist had pitched that story before it happened, readers would have called it too far-fetched. And yet, it was true. Neil Entwistle's 2006 case felt like a suburban psychological thriller. Outwardly, he was the perfect husband, the proud new father. Inwardly, financial ruin and secret habits corroded his life until he snapped, killing his wife and baby before fleeing overseas. It had all the hallmarks of a scripted drama, the facade of perfection, the collapse under hidden lies. Even Michael Peterson's infamous staircase case felt cinematic. A wife found dead at the bottom of the stairs. A husband insisting it was an accident. A trial that became a media spectacle. It was so strange, so full of twists, that it became not one but 2 documentaries, each treating it like an unfolding thriller. The truth is, thrillers and real cases exist in a feedback loop. Writers borrow from true crime to create fiction that feels real. And then audiences judge true crime through the lens of fiction they've consumed. That's why so many people instantly compared Scott Peterson to Nick Dunn or Chris Watts to a character in a Netflix special. It's why Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell's saga was called a real-life horror movie. We don't just watch thrillers, we live in their shadow. And here's the chilling truth. Thrillers give us closure. The villain is caught. The mystery is solved. The credits roll. But for real families, there are no credits. The Rocha family still grieves Lacey and Connor. Shanann's parents still live with the absence of their daughter and grandchildren. The relatives of Tylee and JJ still face unimaginable loss. Thrillers end. Reality doesn't. And that's why true crime lingers. Because in fiction, we can turn off the fear. In reality, we can't. When life inspires fiction. Thrillers don't exist in a vacuum. They aren't just born from imagination. They are built from the raw material of real life. Cases that have unsettled communities, crimes that have haunted families, headlines that have dominated the news. Fiction borrows from reality, shaping those fragments into stories that terrify us precisely because they feel familiar. But the unsettling truth is that sometimes the cycle runs in reverse. Real people borrow from fiction. Real killers model themselves on the characters they've seen on screen. And when life imitates art, the consequences are always darker than the movies ever dared to show. That let's return to Gone Girl. When Amy Dunn disappears, she leaves behind a diary filled with carefully crafted entries. She stages evidence, manipulates perception, and forces the world to believe her husband is guilty. Audiences gasped at the twists. But ask yourself, why was the story so believable? Because by 2014, we had already lived through years of media-saturated cases where perception outweighed proof. Scott Peterson's case was one of them. The diary may have been fiction, but the phenomenon wasn't. In real life, entire narratives had already been built out of photographs, sound bites, and televised interviews. When Gillian Flynn was asked about her inspiration, she admitted it was impossible to ignore the way missing wife cases dominated the headlines. She saw how husbands were judged by demeanor rather than evidence, how wives were turned into symbols rather than people. She saw how media could tilt a case before it ever reached a courtroom. That observation became the foundation of Gone. Girl. Fiction was borrowing directly from the psychology of real cases, and it wasn't just Gone Girl. The infamous story of Michael Petersano. Relation to Scott was so bizarre, so twisted, that it became its own form of entertainment. Kathleen Peterson was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in her North Carolina home in 2001. Michael claimed it was an accident. Prosecutors claimed it was murder. The trial dragged on, full of shocking revelations, including the discovery that another woman close to Michael had also died from a fall downstairs decades earlier. It was so strange that French filmmakers turned it into the documentary The Staircase, which became a sensation. Years later, HBO dramatized it as a limited series, with actors playing out the mystery like a thriller. Real life had become a script, replayed again and again until the line between truth and dramatization disappeared. Another example, Neil Entwistle. In 2006, this British man seemed to be living a picture-perfect suburban life in Massachusetts with his wife and 9-month-old daughter. But beneath the surface, Neil was drowning in financial troubles and secret online habits. When everything collapsed, he killed his wife and daughter before fleeing overseas. The case read like a psychological thriller about the darkness behind suburban walls. Reporters compared it to films like American Beauty, where the polished facade of middle-class perfection concealed dysfunction and despair. Again, fiction had prepared us for the story, and the story in turn reinforced the fiction, but sometimes the influence flows the other way. Real killers have borrowed from thrillers, thinking they could use fiction as a blueprint for crime. Police investigators have uncovered journals, internet searches, and even direct confessions where suspects admitted to studying movies or books to plan their acts. They thought if it worked on screen, it would work in reality. But they always overlooked one thing. Real life leaves traces. Movies cut to the next scene, but reality leaves behind receipts, cell phone pings, CCTV cameras, text messages. That's why so many killers who tried to imitate fiction ended up exposing themselves instead. Consider the chilling detail from Chris Watts's case. In the weeks before murdering his family in 2018, Watts was watching American Murder, The Family Next Door, style documentaries, and researching ways to start over. His phone records showed a fascination with living a new life free of responsibility, mirroring the selfish motives of characters in thrillers. He may not have consciously copied a script, but the parallels were there. The double life, the mistress, the fantasy of escape. In fiction, sometimes the husband gets away with it. In reality, Watts crumbled under the weight of digital evidence. This is the danger of life imitating art. Fiction compresses reality into clean arcs. It leaves out the messy details, the GPS data, the neighbors with doorbell cameras, the investigators who don't stop digging. Real killers who model themselves after thrillers forget that in real life, there's no script to control. And so they fail. But the deeper truth is this. Fiction and reality feed each other in an endless cycle. Writers borrow from true crime to make stories that resonate. Audiences consume those stories and use them as a lens to interpret reality. And real people, even criminals, internalize those stories and sometimes act them out. It is a feedback loop of darkness, each side fueling the other. This is why when people watch Gone Girl, they immediately thought of Scott Peterson. When they watched documentaries about Chris Watts, they described it as a Netflix thriller come to life. When they heard about Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, with their doomsday prophecies and secret marriages, they said it was stranger than any Hollywood script. Fiction and reality had collapsed into one dot, and here's the unsettling part. We, the audience, become part of this cycle too. When we watch a thriller, we learn cues. Husbands who don't cry are guilty. Wives who disappear are innocent. Affairs are motive. Calmness is suspicious. We take those cues and apply them to real life. That's why so many people watching Scott Peterson's press conferences muttered, "He looks guilty." It's why viewers of Chris Watts's interview shook their heads and said, "He's lying." We've been trained by fiction to recognize patterns, and in real life, we become the jury long before a courtroom ever convenes. But here's the problem. Fiction simplifies. It gives us villains who smirk, heroes who fight, endings that resolve. Real life doesn't follow that script. Sometimes guilty men cry rivers of tears. Sometimes innocent people look cold or detached. Sometimes evidence is messy, incomplete, or circumstantial. And yet, Because of fiction, we rush to judgment anyway. When life inspires fiction and fiction shapes life, we find ourselves trapped in a hall of mirrors. A movie is never just a movie. A trial is never just a trial. Every story echoes others, and every echo shapes what we believe to be true. That is why cases like Scott Peterson's endure. It wasn't just about evidence. It was about the narrative. It was about the way he looked like a character we already knew, the perfect husband hiding the perfect lie. It was about the way Lacey looked like the perfect wife, the perfect victim, the perfect contrast. It was about the way Amber Fry stepped into the story as the mistress turned truth teller, the archetype we've seen in countless thrillers. The story felt too familiar, too scripted, too real. And once we recognize a script, we stop questioning the ending. But reality is not a movie. And when we forget that, we risk confusing performance for proof. The archetype of the perfect husband. One of the most haunting patterns in both thrillers and real-life crime is the figure of the perfect husband. On the surface, he appears loving, attentive, and stable. He smiles for family photographs, holds his wife's hand at social gatherings, and seems to embody the dream of marriage and fatherhood. But beneath the surface, another truth may lurk, a truth of selfishness, betrayal, and, in the darkest cases, violence. This archetype fascinates us because it plays on one of our deepest fears, the idea that the person we trust most might be hiding the darkest secret of all. Thrillers have built entire plots on this image, and audiences respond with both horror and recognition. But what makes the archetype so powerful is that it doesn't just belong to fiction. Again and again, real cases reveal husbands who looked perfect from the outside but concealed turmoil, deceit, or worse inside their homes. Think again about Scott Peterson. To neighbors and friends, Scott and Lacey seemed like the golden couple. They had a warm home in Modesto. They were expecting their first child, and they appeared to be living a storybook life. Lacey, with her radiant smile and enthusiasm for decorating, gardening, and motherhood, looked like the quintessential suburban wife. Scott, handsome and easygoing, looked like the reliable partner every woman wanted. In photographs, they looked like the American dream. But appearances are deceiving. Beneath the polished image was a man leading a double life, lying to another woman about being a widower even before his wife vanished. This is the essence of the archetype. The perfect husband is only perfect on the outside. Inside, he is restless, resentful, sometimes narcissistic, sometimes sociopathic. In thrillers, this gap between appearance and reality becomes the source of suspense. In real life, it becomes the source of tragedy. Chris Watts is perhaps the most infamous modern embodiment of this archetype. On social media, Shannon Watts shared videos and photos of her husband playing with their daughters, smiling at barbecues, posing for selfies. To friends and followers, Chris looked like the ideal dad and husband. But in reality, he was entangled in an affair, fantasizing about a new life, and planning the destruction of the family he presented so perfectly online. His double life mirrored the archetype so closely that when the truth came out, people described the case as a real-life Netflix thriller. What makes these men so chilling is not just the crimes they commit, but the masks they wear. They don't look like killers. They look like neighbors, co-workers, the men at backyard barbecues. That mask is what terrifies us most, because if they can hide so well, how can we ever be sure we truly know the people we love? Thrillers dramatize this fear. In Gone Girl, Nick Dunn plays the role of the grieving husband on television, but the audience senses something beneath the surface. In Sleeping with the Enemy, Julia Roberts' character lives with a husband who appears successful and charming to the outside world, but is controlling and abusive behind closed doors. In The Perfect Murder, the polished veneer of a marriage cracks to reveal greed and betrayal. Again and again, the perfect husband is exposed as imperfect in the most dangerous ways. And in real life, cases like Neil Entwistle reinforce the archetype. To outsiders, Entwistle was a loving father with a new baby. In reality, he was drowning in debt and consumed by secret online activities. The mask of perfection shattered when he murdered his wife and daughter before fleeing to England. His story read like a thriller because it followed the archetype step by step. The polished exterior, the hidden darkness, the shocking collapse. But why do so many thrillers and real cases focus on this archetype? Because it strikes at the heart of our cultural ideals. Marriage is supposed to be a sanctuary. The husband is supposed to be protector, provider, partner. When that role is corrupted, when the protector becomes the destroyer, it feels like the ultimate betrayal. That betrayal is more terrifying than any stranger in the dark alley because it comes from inside the home, from the person who was supposed to keep us safe. Psychologists note that the archetype often emerges from deep personality traits. Narcissistic husbands may present a polished exterior to the world, but view their wives and children as extensions of themselves rather than individuals with their own needs. Sociopathic husbands may see relationships as roles to play rather than bonds to honor, slipping easily between charm and cruelty. Others may simply be deeply selfish, willing to discard commitments when they become inconvenient. What unites them all is the massive ability to appear perfect while hiding profound flaws. This is why the archetype is so enduring. It explains why people looked at Scott Peterson's calm demeanor and thought he fits the role. It explains why Chris Watts's awkward interview set off alarms, because he wasn't playing the grieving husband role convincingly enough. It explains why Lori Vallow's new husband, Chad Daybell, became part of a chilling archetype to a partner whose supposed love was wrapped in lies and delusions. The media amplifies the archetype because it tells a clear story. Lacey Peterson was painted as the perfect wife and mother-to-be. Shannon Watts was shown as the devoted mom, posting loving videos of her family. Against such radiant images, the husbands looked darker, colder, and more suspicious. The contrast was irresistible for reporters and audiences alike. And once the archetype took hold, every new detail was interpreted through it. Scott's affair with Amber Fry wasn't just infidelity, it was proof of the mask slipping. Chris Watts's new relationship wasn't just selfish, it was evidence of the perfect husband becoming the ultimate villain. But the danger of the archetype is that it simplifies complex human behavior. Not every husband who appears calm is a killer. Not every family that looks perfect on the outside is hiding tragedy. And yet, because the archetype is so powerful, we use it to interpret reality. We become suspicious of stoicism. We become quick to label. Sometimes that leads us closer to the truth. Other times, it blinds us to it. Still, the archetype persists because it speaks to something primal, the fear of betrayal from within. A stranger hurting us is horrifying. But the idea that the person sleeping beside us, the person holding our child, the person we vowed to share our life with, could turn into our enemy, that is terror on a different level. Thrillers exploit that fear. True crime confirms it, and so the perfect husband remains one of the most chilling characters in both fiction and reality. He is the neighbor who waves with a smile, the father who posts family photos, the husband who looks devoted. But behind the smile, behind the mask, something darker may wait. In thrillers, he is the twist we anticipate. In true crime, he is the nightmare families never saw coming. And that is why we can never look at the image of the perfect husband the same way again. The audience as jury. Whenever a crime grips the public imagination, there are always two trials. The first takes place in the courtroom, where evidence is presented, arguments are made, and a verdict is rendered by 12 jurors sworn to impartiality. The second takes place everywhere else, in living rooms, on social media, in news broadcasts, in whispered conversations among neighbors. This second trial is the trial of perception, and its jury is the audience. We, the viewers, become the ones weighing demeanor, body language, sound bites, and images. And often, we deliver our verdict long before the official one is read aloud. This phenomenon has been amplified in the modern era of constant media. When Lacey Peterson vanished, it wasn't only the Modesto Police Department investigating the case, it was millions of Americans glued to their televisions, parsing every clip of Scott Peterson's interviews. Was he too calm? Did his smile look forced? Did his tone seem detached? These weren't questions asked in a courtroom, they were questions asked in homes and coffee shops and offices. And the answers shaped public perception of Scott's guilt even before jurors were sworn in. The same thing happened with Chris Watts. In August 2018, he gave an interview to local television, pleading for the safe return of Sean Ann and their daughters. He stood on his porch, arms crossed, speaking in a monotone voice. Within hours, the video spread online, and viewers became jurors. People dissected his folded arms, saying it was a defensive posture. They criticized his lack of tears, calling it a red flag. They replayed the interview frame by frame, looking for cracks in his story. By the time police confronted Watts with evidence, much of the public had already rendered him guilty in the trial of perception. Why are we so quick to judge? Because thrillers have taught us what guilt looks like. Fiction trains us to recognize archetypes: the cold husband, the nervous liar, the too perfect smile. When we see those patterns in real life, we instinctively match them to what we've seen on screen. And once the comparison takes root, it colors everything else we see. Take Scott Peterson's press conferences. If a thriller director had staged those moments, the audience would have whispered in the theater, "He's hiding something." The calmness, the hands folded neatly, the lack of visible emotion, all of it looked wrong. And so, audiences at home reached the same conclusion. They didn't need DNA or a murder weapon. They had body language and tone of voice. That was enough for suspicion. But this raises a dangerous question. Are we trained to see the truth, or are we trained to see a script? Because real life doesn't always match fiction. Some guilty people cry rivers of tears. Some innocent people appear stoic. Some liars fumble, while others lie smoothly. Human behavior is messy, unpredictable, and shaped by culture, upbringing, and personality. And yet, in the trial of perception, we flatten all that complexity into simple judgments. Psychologists call this the demeanor bias. We assume that the way someone looks or acts reveals their inner truth. We expect grief to look like sobbing, guilt to look like nervousness, innocence to look like earnestness. But demeanor bias often leads us astray. People grieve differently. People lie differently. And people under stress may act in ways that don't fit our expectations at all. Still, the audience-turned-jury rarely acknowledges this. Instead, we double down on our interpretations. We share them on social media, we argue them with friends, we post them in comment sections. Before long, the collective perception hardens into something close to a verdict. By the time a trial begins, many people feel they already know the truth. And sometimes, jurors themselves admit they entered the courtroom with opinions already formed. This is why cases like Peterson's and Watts's sparked such enduring debates. It isn't just about the evidence. It's about the performances we witnessed. The interviews, the press conferences, the body language. They became part of the evidence in the trial of perception. And once the audience rendered its verdict, it became almost impossible to unsee. But let's step back and ask, why do we want to play jury at all? Why do we lean into these stories with such intensity, dissecting every gesture, every word, as though our opinion has the power to convict or acquit? Part of it is human nature. We are storytelling creatures. We want villains and heroes, motives and resolutions. When a wife vanishes or a family is destroyed, we need an explanation. We need a narrative that makes sense of the chaos, and so we become participants in the story. We aren't content to sit back and watch. We want to solve it. We want to catch the lie, to predict the twist, to be the one who knew all along. Thrillers encourage this instinct, inviting us to guess the ending before the reveal. True crime cases trigger the same reflex. But unlike thrillers, these stories don't end with credits. They end with real verdicts, real sentences, real lives destroyed. The danger is that when the audience becomes the jury, we blur the line between perception and proof. We treat demeanor as evidence, forgetting that the law requires more. We build narratives around appearances, forgetting that truth is often more complicated. And in the rush to convict in the trial of perception, we sometimes risk convicting the wrong person or excusing the right one. Still, the trial of perception is unavoidable. It is part of the human condition. From the moment we meet someone, we make judgments. Are they trustworthy? Are they dangerous? Do they look guilty? These snap judgments kept our ancestors alive in a world full of threats. In the modern world, they shape our opinions about husbands on television who may or may not be killers. And so, every time a case like Scott Peterson's or Chris Watts's captures the public eye, we repeat the same cycle. The press conference becomes a performance. The interview becomes a stage. The audience becomes the jury. And once we've rendered our verdict, it is hard to undo. This is why perception matters as much as evidence. Because even if a jury of 12 decides a man's fate in court, millions of others have already decided it in their living rooms. And their verdict, our verdict, becomes part of the story, part of the legacy, part of the enduring debate that keeps these cases alive long after the gavel falls. Why we love the darkness. There's a question at the center of all this. Why do we watch? Why do millions of people flock to movies like Gone Girl or Prisoners, or spend hours binging true crime documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube breakdowns of murder cases? Why do we, as a culture, consume stories of betrayal, disappearance, and death with such fascination? The answer is not simple. It lies in psychology, in biology, in storytelling, and in something far older than television or cinema. It lies in our nature as human beings drawn to darkness not because we celebrate it, but because it teaches us, warns us, and reminds us what we fear losing most. Thrillers tap into something primal. They take the ordinary, the home, the family, the marriage, and corrupt it. That's why they're so effective. They don't scare us with monsters lurking in caves or aliens from other worlds. They scare us with something closer. The husband in the kitchen, the wife in the bedroom, the child on the front lawn. They scare us with the idea that what looks safe can be unsafe, that what looks familiar can be dangerous. This is why thrillers feel more frightening than horror to so many people. Horror may give us jump scares, but thrillers unsettle us by turning trust into treachery. The person who should protect us becomes the person who destroys us. That betrayal is a deeper wound than any ghost or ghoul could ever inflict. Psychologists call this the violation of the safe haven. Our homes, our families, our relationships, these are supposed to be safe. When they become sites of danger, our most basic assumptions about the world collapse. That collapse generates fear, fascination, and an overwhelming need to understand. But beyond fear, thrillers and true crime also give us something else, a safe way to confront danger. When we sit in a theater or scroll through a documentary, we feel the tension without being in danger ourselves. Our hearts race, our palms sweat, but deep down, we know we're safe. Psychologists call this benign masochism, the strange human enjoyment of negative emotions when they're experienced in a safe context. It's the same instinct that makes us love roller coasters, haunted houses, or sad songs. We seek the emotional intensity, not because we want pain, but because we want the thrill without the consequences. True crime works the same way, except the consequences are real. The families are real. The victims are real. And yet, we consume these stories for the same reason we consume thrillers, because they let us experience danger vicariously. We look at Scott Peterson or Chris Watts or Lori Vallow and think, what if it were me? What if it were my family? Would I see the signs? Would I survive? The stories become cautionary tales, teaching us lessons we hope we'll never need, but want to know just in case. There's also the dopamine factor. Neuroscientists have studied what happens when we engage with suspenseful stories. Our brains release dopamine during moments of tension, giving us a chemical thrill that keeps us hooked. It's the same rush we get from sports, gambling, or cliffhangers in TV shows. We lean in, desperate to know what happens next, because our brains are wired to crave resolution. That's why we binge entire series in one sitting. That's why we read crime novels until 3 in the morning. The unresolved mystery keeps the dopamine flowing, and the resolution delivers the payoff. But when it comes to real cases, the resolution is rarely clean. There's no neatly wrapped ending. Even when a killer is caught, the questions remain. Why did they do it? Could it have been prevented? What did the victims experience in their final moments? This lack of closure frustrates us, but it also keeps us coming back. The mystery lingers, unsolved in our minds, demanding more attention. That's why we revisit cases like Scott Peterson's decades later, still arguing about guilt and innocence. That's why Chris Watts continues to dominate true crime discussions years after his confession. The darkness refuses to resolve, and so we can't look away. Another reason we love the darkness is empathy. As much as we focus on killers, many of us watch these stories to connect with victims. We see Lacey's radiant smile, Shanann's videos with her daughters, Tylee and JJ's photographs, and we feel grief for people we never knew. That grief, strange as it may sound, is part of why we keep watching. It's not just morbid curiosity. It's a form of collective mourning, a way of acknowledging lives lost too soon. Thrillers give us fictional victims. True crime gives us real ones. And when we cry for them, we remind ourselves that empathy is still alive, even in a world that sometimes feels devoid of it. Of course, there's a darker side to our fascination. Some critics argue that consuming true crime turns tragedy into entertainment, reducing real people's suffering to plots for our amusement. And they're not wrong. There's an uncomfortable truth in the fact that we click, we stream, we binge, while families are left with empty chairs at the dinner table. Thrillers at least admit they're fiction. True crime forces us to confront the ethics of watching real pain. Yet, perhaps, that discomfort is also part of why we watch. It reminds us that these aren't just stories. They're warnings. They tell us to look closer, to question more, to be wary of the masks people wear. They remind us that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a husband smiling in a photograph, or a wife planning a vacation, or a neighbor waving from across the street. And here is the paradox at the core of our love for darkness. We are both entertained and educated by it. We consume thrillers and true crime because they scare us, thrill us, and warn us. We learn about manipulation, deception, red flags. We learn not to take things at face value. We learn that the safe haven isn't always safe. And even if the lesson comes wrapped in tragedy, we take it in because some part of us hopes that knowledge will protect us. This is why the fascination endures. Because darkness, whether fictional or real, shows us the fragile threads holding our lives together. It makes us grateful for the families who come home safe. It makes us vigilant about the people who don't. And it reminds us that the line between safety and danger is thinner than we'd like to believe. Why do we love the darkness? Because it's part of us. Because it teaches us. Because it terrifies us. And because, deep down, we know that ignoring it won't make it go away. Reality is always darker. Thrillers end with resolution. The mystery is solved, the villain is caught, the credits roll, and we leave the theater with our hearts still racing, but our questions answered. That's part of the comfort of fiction. It takes chaos and shapes it into order. But reality does not give us that luxury. Reality leaves threads hanging, questions unanswered, grief unresolved. And that is why reality is always darker than fiction. When audiences watched Gone Girl, they were fascinated by Amy Dunn's manipulations, her diary entries, her careful framing of her husband. The story twisted and turned, but by the end, there was a kind of resolution. The audience could debate the ending, but the narrative had closure. Real life offers no such closure. Scott Peterson was convicted, yes, but decades later, debates still rage. Was the evidence strong enough? Was he condemned more by perception than by proof? Was justice served, or was a man judged by demeanor? For the Rocha family, the verdict brought some relief, but it did not bring Lacey back. It did not erase the empty chair at the table or the absence of Connor. The darkness continued. The same can be said of Chris Watts. His confession brought clarity, but not comfort. Shanann's family still lives with the knowledge that their daughter and grandchildren were taken from them in the most brutal way. No amount of evidence, no confession, no sentencing could ever make that right. Thrillers would have us believe that catching the villain ends the story. Reality reminds us that it is only the beginning of lifelong grief. This is one of the starkest differences between fiction and reality. In thrillers, victims are symbols. In reality, they are people. Lacey was not just the pregnant wife. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Shanann was not just the murdered wife. She was a mother, a businesswoman, a woman with hopes and plans. Tylee and JJ were not just missing children. They were kids with laughter, with favorite foods, with unfinished futures. Thrillers flatten victims into archetypes. Reality forces us to confront the fullness of what was lost. And yet, because we consume real crime the way we consume thrillers, we sometimes forget this distinction. We click on documentaries, we watch interviews, we dissect press conferences, and we treat real people's tragedies as story arcs. We demand resolution, even when resolution is impossible. We expect answers, even when none exist. We want to know why Scott Peterson did what he did, why Chris Watts betrayed his family, why Lori Vallow became consumed by doomsday delusions. But the truth is that sometimes there is no why that satisfies. Sometimes darkness just exists, inexplicable and cruel. Thrillers comfort us by making motives clear. The villain wanted money, freedom, revenge. The plan was calculated, the clues were planted, the truth was revealed. Reality is murkier. Scott's motive remains debated. Watts's motive was shallow, selfish, incomprehensible. Lori Vallow's motive was clouded in apocalyptic fantasies. None of it feels neat, and that lack of neatness unsettles us. We want reasons, but reality rarely provides them. The grief of families is another layer of darkness fiction cannot capture. In movies, the story ends when the killer is caught or the victim is found. In reality, the story continues forever for those left behind. Sharon Rocha wakes up every day knowing her daughter and grandson are gone. Shanann's parents celebrate birthdays without their daughter and granddaughters. Kay and Larry Woodcock, the grandparents of J.J. Vallow, keep fighting in courtrooms and interviews, still haunted by the children they will never see again. For them, the crime is not a chapter in a story. It is the rest of their lives. Even when justice is served, reality resists closure. Scott Peterson's death sentence was overturned years after his conviction, reopening old wounds, reigniting old debates. Each headline dragged the Rocha family back into their nightmare. Fiction would never do this. Fiction would end the story cleanly. Reality drags pain out for decades. And then there are the mysteries that never resolve at all. Think of cases where bodies are never found, where suspects are never convicted, where families are left in endless limbo. Thrillers might tease ambiguity, but they always end. Reality offers no such promise. For many families, the story never ends. It just becomes an unanswered question that shadows them forever. This is why reality is always darker, because it does not care about narrative satisfaction. It does not care about neatness. It does not care about what we, as an audience, want. Reality is messy, cruel, and indifferent. It leaves us with holes that cannot be filled, grief that cannot be eased, questions that cannot be answered. And yet, perhaps this is why we consume real crime with such intensity. Because deep down, we know that life rarely gives us closure. We know that stories don't always end neatly. And by watching, by analyzing, by consuming, we try to impose some kind of order on the chaos. We turn reality into story, because story is how we survive. But even as we turn reality into story, we must not forget that reality is darker than anything Hollywood could ever write. Because thrillers end, reality doesn't. Reflection and call to action. When we step back from thrillers and true crime cases alike, a sobering truth emerges. What frightens us most is not the unknown, but the familiar. It's not the shadow in the alley, the stranger on the street, or the monster lurking in the dark. It's the face at the dinner table, the hand we hold, the smile we trust. That is why stories like Gone Girl, Prisoners, and countless thrillers resonate so deeply, and why real cases like Scott Peterson, Chris Watts, and Lori Vallow stay with us for years. They don't just entertain us. They shatter our illusions about safety, trust, and love. Think about it. In fiction, Nick Dunn becomes the suspicious husband, and Amy Dunn becomes the manipulative wife. We leave the theater knowing their characters, symbols, exaggerations of human flaws. But in Modesto, California, Lacey Peterson never came home. In Colorado, Shannon Watts and her daughters never got to finish their lives. In Idaho, Tylee and J.J. Vallow never grew up. These were not characters. These were people. And yet, in order to process their tragedies, we often turn them into characters anyway. We compare them to roles in thrillers. We assign them archetypes: the perfect wife, the perfect husband, the villain, the mistress, the accomplice. That instinct is deeply human. We are storytelling creatures. Our brains crave narrative. When faced with chaos, we impose order by telling a story. And in the process, we blur the lines between fiction and reality. That is why Scott Peterson was compared to Nick Dunn. Why Chris Watts was described as if he had walked out of a Netflix script. Why Lori Vallow's saga was called a horror movie come to life. We cannot separate story from truth. But as much as stories help us make sense of chaos, they can also distort. Fiction simplifies, reality complicates. Thrillers give us clean motives: money, freedom, revenge. Reality gives us murky motives: selfishness, cowardice, delusion. Thrillers give us closure. Reality gives us grief. Thrillers give us entertainment. Reality gives us scars that never heal. This is why reflection matters. Because if we consume true crime only as entertainment, we risk forgetting the humanity at the heart of these tragedies. We risk turning Lacey into just the pregnant wife, Shannon into just the murdered mother, Tylee and JJ into just the missing children. But they were more than that. They were lives full of laughter, potential, and love. And their families live with holes that no narrative can ever fill. Yes, oh, what lessons do we take from the overlap of thrillers and real crime? First, that appearances deceive. The smiling family photo may hide betrayal. The polished marriage may conceal cracks. The husband who looks perfect may be hiding a double life. Thrillers dramatize this truth, but real cases prove it. Second, that perception is powerful. We must be cautious not to confuse demeanor with guilt or calmness with innocence. Thrillers train us to read cues, but real life is more complicated. People grieve differently. People lie differently. The truth is rarely as clear as it looks on screen. Third, that darkness fascinates us not because we celebrate it, but because we fear it. We watch thrillers and consume true crime because they help us prepare for the unimaginable. They teach us red flags, warning signs, and patterns of manipulation. They remind us that evil often looks ordinary. And finally, that reality is darker than fiction because it never ends. There are no credits for Sharon Rocha, for Shanann's parents, for Kay and Larry Woodcock. Their pain is not a story arc. It is their life. And when we watch, when we consume, when we debate, we must remember that truth. This reflection leaves us with an unsettling but necessary question. What does our fascination with these stories say about us? Do we consume them only for entertainment or also for empathy? Do we watch to be thrilled or to be warned? Do we see only villains and victims, or do we recognize the human lives beneath the headlines? Perhaps the most important step we can take is to balance fascination with compassion. To remember that behind every thriller come to life headline is a family that never asked to be part of the story. To honor victims not only as characters in a narrative, but as people whose lives mattered beyond their deaths. And so, as we close episode 1 of this series, I want to invite you to reflect, not only on the stories you consume, but on the way you consume them. Do you pause to think about the real people at the heart of these tragedies? Do you recognize when fiction is shaping your perception of reality? Do you question the narratives you're given, or do you accept them as truth? These reflections are uncomfortable, but they are necessary because the line between thrillers and true crime will always be blurred. Stories will continue to borrow from reality, and reality will continue to be judged through the lens of story. The only thing we can control is how we, as an audience, respond. Asterisk if you found this episode valuable. If you believe in exploring these stories with honesty and depth, please subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what's coming next. Leave a comment below. Tell me, which thriller do you think mirrors reality most closely? Gone Girl? Prisoners? Or another story that blurred the line for you? And if you'd like to go even deeper, I invite you to join as a channel member. Membership helps support the work that goes into creating these long, detailed documentaries. And in return, members get exclusive perks. You'll be able to request future cases and topics, vote on what we cover next, and even get behind-the-scenes updates as we build this series together. Think of it as becoming part of the investigation yourself, shaping where we go and which dark truths we uncover. Because in episode 2, we'll move from fiction versus reality into the psychology behind manipulation. We'll break down the 10 dark psychology tricks manipulators use and show how real killers, like Chris Watts, Chad Doerman, and Meshach Damasus them in their everyday lives. Gaslighting, love bombing, silent treatment, cycles of charm and cruelty, these are the tactics that turn ordinary relationships into nightmares. And understanding them may be the most powerful tool we have to protect ourselves. Thrillers will always scare us. Reality will always terrify us more. But together, by subscribing, by joining, by engaging, We can keep exposing these dark truths. So hit subscribe. Click that join button if you want to be part of the inner circle. And I'll see you in episode 2.